Hello and welcome to Stuart Saturday Live with me, your hostess, Andrea Zuvich, the 17th century lady. My guest today will be naval historian and novelist J D Davies, and we'll be talking about Samuel Pepys, Van der Velde art, the Anglo-Dutch War, the Stuart Navy, and more. He'll be with us in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to take the opportunity to say that the past couple of weeks have been pretty incredible for me. Uh, First, I was a guest on Susanna Lipscomb's history hit podcast, Not Just the Tudors, in which we discussed the scandalous life of Barbara Villiers. We went over Barbara's childhood, her first love with Philip Stanhope, the Earl of Chesterfield, some of her dramatic aspects of her life, her role in the destruction of Nonsuch Palace, and more. The link to that episode will be listed under this video on YouTube and has been and will be posted again elsewhere as well. I'd like to thank Susanna and the producers of Not Just the Tudors for inviting me to talk about Barbara. Speaking of that luscious lady, last week I celebrated the launch of my book, Ravenous, A Life of Barbara Villiers, Charles II's most infamous mistress. Let's have a little look at the video from my launch. So here we have some of my books on display, and that's me being very happy because it's been several years in the making, of course. And we had a cake that was personalized from party pieces, and these are cupcakes with edible wafers that my daughter and I made, and it was fun. It was a nice family thing to do, and the drink that we have, and this is the sparkling tea, and it's from Fortnum& Mason, and it was really nice. I had a lovely time. I would like to thank everyone, those who have submitted reviews via NetGalley, on Instagram and elsewhere. I've enjoyed seeing photos of the book out and about, especially those who have taken photos of the book in front of portraits of Barbara at stately homes. Those have been really fun to see. I really appreciate all the support. You've all been so lovely. So thank you so much. And just another look at it, because I'm just so excited about it. It's that thick, and that's the back cover with lovely quotes from Charles Spencer and Deborah Swift. And inside you have the images. We have lots of images, and there we go. But I'm very, very grateful to be able to be here and see it launch. I was so poorly a few years ago, and to be able to have survived my illness and everything else has been it's been very special to me. So thank you so much. Well, that's enough of that. It's time for our history chat. Today's guest is a beloved figure in Stuart era history and historical fiction circles. He is the author of the best-selling naval historical fiction series, The Journals of Matthew Quinton, among other works. He is the chair for the Society of Nautical Research. He's a fellow of the Society of Nautical Research and of the Royal Historical Society. And most importantly, in my opinion, he's a really nice guy. Joining us live from Ickwell in Bedfordshire, England, please welcome J D Davies.
Hi, Andrea.
Hello, David. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
I've had the pleasure of knowing you for about over a decade now, I think.
That's big.
And it's always been such a delight to meet up with you at conferences and other events. And especially at a pub. That's fun. Um, for those who have yet to read your works, um, would you please tell us a bit about yourself and what started your interest in 17th century naval history and history in general, perhaps?
Oh, well, history in general. I mean, the story my parents always told was that they took me to Pembroke Castle when I was 5, and I was hooked from then on. And
Oh,
it just went from there. And I say it's the silly thing. By the time I was about 13, it was 17th century history, because one of the first things I ever wrote was in the school newspaper. It was around the time that the Richard Harris, Alec Guinness film of Cromwell came out. And
right.
I did a huge review of that, tearing apart all the historical inaccuracies in the film. I've got a bit more mellow since then, really, but yeah, I mean, it's a long story, but eventually I got a doctorate, which was in 17th century naval history, and I went on from there to start writing non-fiction on that subject, and then eventually I branched out into fiction. I'd always had, a desire to write fiction, and I'd sort of had all these goes at very bad James Bond clones for years, and eventually I thought, well, hang on a minute, I've been researching 17th century naval history properly for all this time. I think if I was going to write a novel about anything, it should be about that. And so it went from there, and I started putting together this idea, and the idea luckily took off.
That's fantastic. I was wondering, do you often go out to sea yourself? I mean, are you into going on ships and that sort of thing and fishing?
Not as much as I'd like. I mean, for one thing, obviously, that's one of the downsides of living in Bedfordshire. It's one of the most inland counties in England,
Mm.
and so it takes at least 2 hours to get to the nearest bit of sea in any direction. But I mean, yeah, I've sailed on various craft in the past, down in West Wales, where I'm originally from, and various other areas as well. But the real eye opener for me was, excuse me, the school I worked in for many years had what was called a combined cadet force section,
Oh,
and
right.
I was able to join that as an officer, so one of the trainees, basically the teachers who would take the cadets out. And so that technically gave me the rank of a sub-lieutenant in the Royal Naval Reserve. And as a result of that, I did all these wonderful trips on Royal Naval ships and auxiliaries. And that gave me a lot of insights, which were really helpful, both with the serious academic books and with the fiction, and into the way that ships work even nowadays, and the way naval personnel think and act, and the things they say, and so on.
Wow, fantastic. Um, yeah, I didn't know that about you. That's great. That's awesome. Um, now, uh, let's see. We have an image coming up of a 17th century warship. Here it is. And this was taken by you, and it's quite interesting. You'll have to forgive me, being a social historian, and I'm usually very much out of my depth with all things military and naval. And I will be asking somewhat simplistic questions. Okay, so for those who are hardcore military and naval historians out there, this is only because I want to be able to reach more of the audience, people who haven't encountered this type of history before, and so that's what's going to be happening. Um, what kind of ships and weapons would have been used or were used by the Navy in the late Stuart era?
Okay, well, I mean, this picture is actually from Sweden. It's of a reconstruction of a gun deck on the ship called the Cronin, which sank
Oh,
in 1676. And there's a wonderful museum in Kalmar in Sweden. It's got things they brought up from the wreck and so on, marvelous artifacts. But this would have been a typical gun deck on a larger 17th century warship. The largest ships had 3 decks. I mean, not too different to HMS Victory, really, in Portsmouth. Obviously, Victory was quite a bit later, but I mean, it's the same basic design that you have. By this period, the guns are very much on the broadside, so they're on both sides of the ship. And you've got then the different classes. So in the Royal Navy in this period, you had 6 classes, or rates as they called them. The first rates were the biggest ones, with about 90 to 100 guns, all the way down to the 6th rates, which were pretty small. And so, these were the great instruments of war in the time. Not only that, I mean, this was the highest tech in the period. These were the most sophisticated technology out there, because you had all the ropes, the blocks, the tackles, you had all the weapons, as you can see, the guns. These were incredibly sophisticated for the time. And so they were also pretty expensive by definition. And as a result, naval warfare was a very brutal, very expensive business. And having the guns along the side inevitably meant you got into what was called line of battle warfare, where 2 huge fleets sat parallel to each other and just tried to blast each other to bits. And so, as I say, it was incredibly vicious. Great if you're writing fiction, but you're all these wonderful battle scenes you can recreate.
Wow, I see. And this area, it's a museum that is generally open to the public, or did you have to get special permission to enter?
Oh yeah, it's open to the public and anybody can go there. I mean, the only problem is that Kalmar is quite a tricky part of Sweden to get to, and I had a very memorable arrival there. I took a connecting flight down from Stockholm. It was in February, and it was a snowstorm. It's a tiny airport. It was a tiny plane, and so landing at Kalmar Airport in a snowstorm in February is pretty memorable.
I bet it was. Oh gosh. Wow. You commissioned a painting from the amazing Richard Ensor, and this is a stunning work. I'd love to know more about what we're looking at here and what you commissioned it for, please.
Okay, well, I'm actually, if I look up, directly opposite me now is the original of that in the original 17th century frame that it's in. This was the cover of the original edition of my first novel, Gentleman Captain. And Richard very kindly volunteered to recreate the sort of the climactic scene of the book, and produce this fantastic painting, which, as I say, has hung on my wall above the fireplace ever since. So it was great that he was willing to do that. Excuse this cough of mine. I've been trying to shake it and failed.
Fine.
And he recreated it so well. This was pretty much exactly the vision I had in my head. And if people aren't aware of Richard's work, he's got some tremendous books that have been brought out, and they should really go and look at those.
Oh yes, his work is extraordinary. May I ask what medium he used? What
Oil.
is this? Oil. Wow, wow, that
Yeah.
is that's amazing.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful. Yep, and I second what you said. He's done wonderful work, and if the members of our audience have not yet come across his work, I would advise you to seek that out because it is wonderful. Um, my husband Gavin enjoyed a real ale with you in Oxford a few years ago.
Yes.
Yeah, and We have had some questions sent in uh, ahead
Mhm.
by a member of our audience. In the late 17th century, would beer have been on ships? What kind of beer would the sailors have had? And do you yourself prefer a hoppy or malty brew?
Okay, yeah. Now it's probably going to be heresy in present company, but I mean, although I was having a pint of real ale that time we met up,
Mhm,
and probably I'd go for malty. I mean, I have to admit I am usually a lager drinker.
mhm.
So, sorry, I mean, I know it's one of the worst sins imaginable, and Gavin will probably, cut off the broadcast now straight away. Um,
No.
but 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 going to the other part of the question, I mean, yeah, beer was a hugely important part of life in the Navy at that time. I mean, to the extent that part of every man's daily allowance, the daily victualling allowance, was 8 pints of beer,
Mm,
compulsory in effect. Now, okay, we are talking about small beer, that they still
mm,
had to,
yes.
as I said just now, it was incredibly high tech, also very dangerous, and you get all sorts of incredibly nasty injuries on those ships. And so the
Mm,
last thing you want is for the workforce to be staggering all over the deck, absolutely drunk after 8 pints of beer. So I mean, it
yeah.
wasn't it wasn't terribly strong, but of course it's part of the fact that you can't necessarily trust the water all the time,
Mm, yeah.
and so the beer gets around that problem. And yes, I mean a lot of the issues to do with getting the fleet out there and having the fleet working successfully is to do with providing it with beer, and things like the loading of the barrels into the ship. It was a huge task, and ensuring that everything was stacked properly and was available when it was needed. If the beer went off, I mean, there were all sorts of problems and huge discontent.
Oh, I see.
Mm.
Um, your book, Pepys's Navy, Ships, Men, and Warfare, 1649 to 89, was the winner of the 2009 Samuel Pepys Prize. Now, Samuel Pepys is best known as a diarist of the Restoration period, but his actual job had much to do with the Navy. For those in our audience who may not know much about him, would you please explain to us what Pepys's job was and what duties that role entailed? For example, what would a typical day for him be like, please?
Yeah,
Mhm.
a typical day for Pepys would not be a typical day for anybody working in any occupation these days, because he didn't really have a typical day. I mean, although he had a couple of very responsible jobs from 1660 to 73, so there's the whole diary period and beyond it. He
Mhm.
was clerk of the Acts of the Navy Board. Now, in those days, the Navy had two main administrative bodies. It had the Admiralty, which was the higher body and dealt with strategy and policy and so on, and the Navy Board, which handled the day-to-day administration. And so he was clerk of the Acts of the Navy Board, then from 1673 to 79, and then again from 1684 to 88, he was the Secretary of the Admiralty, so he got promoted.
Mm.
But we know a lot about his period at the Navy Board because obviously it is the diary period. But if you read the diary, it's sometimes very difficult to work out what Pepys is actually doing on a particular day when, nowadays we're so conditioned to the idea of you go into the office, you do your job from 9 to 5, you go
Mm.
home.
Yeah.
Well, with Pepys, for example, he might get up with a stinking hangover very late in the morning indeed.
Yeah.
He might then hear there's a new play on, an interesting new play, and so he'll go off to a matinee in the theatre. And then he might deign to stroll into the office for an hour or two in the evening, perhaps go off to the pub or to another play or something like that, and then go to the office from about midnight to 2 o'clock in the morning. The hours were incredibly erratic. And by modern standards, we'd think, well, this is crazy. And of course, ultimately, the fact that he was often working very late at night by very poor candlelight is one of the reasons why he stopped writing his diary. Because he became afraid that his eyesight did seem to be going, and he was convinced he was going to go blind. And therefore he stopped writing the diary, which obviously was a tragedy for the rest of us, because if he'd written it for much, much longer, well, goodness knows what wonderful material we'd got out of it.
Oh, that's true. And later on, he had his own big adventures. I mean, he had an incident with highwaymen that came, I think, in the 80s or so. So just because he stopped his diary entries doesn't mean that everything ended there. And that's the thing. He just kept going, but he didn't write it down.
Oh no, exactly. He lives for another 34 years after the end of the diary, and people often forget that he had a whole second half to his life still to come.
Yes. I just want to point out that David has also written the introduction to Samuel Pepys. Here we go. Memoirs of the Royal Navy, 1690. So that's something that I do recommend as well. Well, read as much Pepys, read as much of Dr. Davies' work as well, and you'll be there. Let's see. Next, many people may not know about the Anglo-Dutch Wars, which took place in the mid-17th century. They are traditionally categorized into three: the First Anglo-Dutch War, the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and the Third Anglo-Dutch War. The First Anglo-Dutch War had taken place during the interregnum, and those who fought during the period included the Englishman Robert Blake and the Dutchman Martin Harpert-Zoontramp. We could devote a whole show to these wars, but in short, would you please tell us the significance of these wars and why perhaps they're not as well known as other wars?
Well, okay, I suppose I'm biased. I'll declare that straight away. But I mean, I would say that these wars, these wars are incredibly significant. Just to give one example, of course, if these wars hadn't happened, then New York may still be called New Amsterdam.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah.
Now, okay, they were supposedly primarily about trade, and to a huge extent they were about trade, but they weren't just about trade. There were a whole range of issues to do with them. As to why they're not as well known as some of the other wars of the period, well, I think there's a number of reasons for this. I mean, clearly, as the name implies, they are Anglo-Dutch wars. Those are the two nations involved. Now, okay, other countries do get dragged in various ways at different times. France, especially on the Dutch side in the Second War, and then the British side in the Third War. But in a way, in terms of great European history and great European events, you can almost regard it as well. These two maritime countries on the edge, on the periphery, are just having their own private little battles and fighting it out with each other. I think they're much bigger than that, as I say. Also, of course, they're pretty short. They only last a couple of years each. And so when you compare them with the wars that come on later in the century, like the War of the League of Augsburg, whatever you want to call it, the one after 1689, or the War of the Spanish Succession after that, and obviously
Yeah.
the 30 Years' War before that.
Yes.
They don't see him as massively significant. Plus, they're fought on water. Now, with wars on land, people, and by people I'm including most historians, incidentally, are much more comfortable with things that are going on land for obvious reasons, because the sea is a very strange environment. It's a very dangerous environment. Naval history is very much a kind of domain unto itself, with all sorts of strange, weird technical language that, you're going to be a real nerd like me to get into all of that sort of thing. Yes, so there's all sorts of reasons why it's neglected. But when I say it's neglected overwhelmingly in this country. You go to the Netherlands, it's the opposite. This is their great age. The Dutch call this period their golden age.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Admiral de Ruyter is regarded as their Nelson. He's their great hero. The most expensive Dutch film ever made is about de Ruyter. So
Wow.
it's a different way of looking at things.
Yes. As the Second Anglo-Dutch War raged on between England and the Dutch Republic, the days of 12th to the 14th of June 1667 saw the raid on the Medway, an audacious attack by the Dutch, who stealthily sailed up the River Medway and attacked the ill-protected navy ships there. On top of England being successfully attacked by the Dutch, who dealt a massive blow to the Stuart Navy, the Dutch went away with quite a prize in the form of the Royal Charles. And you've taken a photo of it. And this is what's left of the Royal Charles. This is the stone piece, I believe. And it's on display at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam to this day. I remember feeling quite odd about seeing this on show when I visited the museum back in 2012, I believe. Some of my dear friends are Dutch, and it's funny to think that we are so close and friendly now, but the British and the Dutch were at war, and there was great enmity between the two nations at that time. So what are your thoughts about this event, the raid on the Medway?
Well, yeah, I mean, again, it's a classic example of the different perceptions on the two sides of the North Sea. That, over on this side of the North Sea, we prefer to sort of brush it under the carpet and forget about it. Whereas on the Dutch side, inevitably, again, this is one of the greatest moments in their history, without doubt. And it was great fun. I must admit, back in 2017, which was the 350th anniversary, and there were all sorts of celebrations and junketing and so on, and a huge Dutch fleet of yachts sailed up the Medway, and there were all sorts of recreations going on, and quite a lot of us went over to the Netherlands, and there were conferences in both countries. It was fantastic. It was a great time, certainly a great time to be a 17th century naval historian. And yeah, and there's no doubt that as far as British history is concerned, it's up there with the fall of Singapore in 1942 as the worst defeat in this country's history, in terms of a single event. And arguably, it was worse. It was more humiliating because, of course, it was on British territory, in right up a British waterway in front of the city of Rochester, and so on. It was really close to home, and I think that's what struck Charles II personally. Plus the fact, of course, it was the ship he had named after himself and his father. And there's the royal arms, the Stuart royal arms.
Yes.
On the
So
stern.
clearly visible.
And
Yeah.
it's the one piece of the ship the Dutch kept. They
Yes,
eventually.
the rest was scrapped, was it not?
It was. I mean, it is very difficult to preserve wooden ships now, when it was certainly much more difficult in the 17th century. I mean, I don't think it helped the fact that they actually, for a few years, they had it as effectively a floating pub. And which again, I think probably really annoyed Charles. The fact that this ship, his flagship, that he'd lavished so much care on, was now just being used by Dutch people to go for a pint.
Yeah. Yes. Well, the situation was somewhat exacerbated by King Charles II's behavior. On the 21st of June, Pepys said that he learned that everyone at court was talking about how on the night the Dutch attacked, the king had been supping with Barbara and other courtiers at the Duchess of Monmouth's residence, and that they spent their evening chasing after a moth that had got itself trapped inside the room. So the attack was already a national embarrassment, a humiliation, but the knowledge that the king had been engaging in silly behavior with his mistress and their overindulged friends while it occurred made some of the public downright angry. Is that fair enough to say?
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no doubt about it. And of course, I mean, you've got the downfall of Clarendon as part and
Absolutely.
parcel of the same period. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the great crisis of confidence, and the first great crisis of confidence in Charles II. And if there ever been a honeymoon period after the Restoration, well, it really does all fall apart
Mhm.
over this. And yes, the poor old moth does play a part in that.
Yeah. And we should mention that this was after the Great Fire of London. So this was
Mm, mm,
1667, so nearly a year later.
mm.
Um, Speaking of the Dutch, Willem van der Velde, the elder, and his son, also Willem van der Velde, the younger, were quite important artists from the Stuart period. They were and remain some of the most influential maritime painters of the 17th century.
Mm.
They were originally from Amsterdam, which was then in the Dutch Republic, and they left their homeland in the 1670s. As you can see in the striking image from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam by Willem van der Velde the Younger, he's captured a moment of action. This painting, entitled The Cannon Shot, was painted circa 1680, and according to the description from the Rijksmuseum, a Dutch warship fires a cannon shot, and the ship lies still on the smooth water. In the distance, another Dutch ship can be seen with lowered sails. Now, I'm afraid this has had to be cropped, so if you can, do look up as many as you can of the works of the Van der Veldes. Unfortunately, there's also a great deal of copyright, so I couldn't get more more images for the purposes of this episode. However, the Queen's House is well worth a visit for Stuart history lovers. And we'll be seeing the inside of that shortly. Indeed, here we go. Thank you. Indeed, I recommend anyone who loves this period in history to have at least one day in Greenwich. Go to the National Maritime Museum, the Royal Observatory, the Queen's House, see the Painted Hall. All of this has fascinating 17th century history. But I digress. David, you took this photo at the Queen's House. Can you please tell us about what's happening here, please?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you said, I mean, the Van der Veldes basically were headhunted, in effect, by Charles II. I mean, they were clearly far and away the greatest maritime artists of the period. And they already had a tremendous reputation by the late 1660s, early 1670s. So they were made an offer they couldn't refuse. Um, pardon me, to come over to England and to work for Charles instead.
Mhm.
And one of the incentives he made to them was, well, they could have a studio in the Queen's house. Now, that's the sort of offer you're going to take pretty seriously. And this was a kind of a reconstruction, or an imagined reconstruction of their studio that the National Maritime Museum did. They had a big exhibition of Van der Velde's from sort of mid to late 22 through to the spring of last year. And,
Mm.
so they had a lot of the originals on the walls, as you can see, but they also had this go at recreating the studio, the Van der Velde's. And yeah, I mean, their art is tremendous. And people who are even vaguely interested in art of any kind, and particularly obviously maritime art,
Mhm.
and ships and the sea, just go through, Google as many Van der Velde's as you can,
Yeah.
because they're wonderful, and they obviously inspired artists all the way down through Turner, for example. I mean, Turner was very, very inspired by the work of the Van der Velde's, and
Yeah.
so many other artists of the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah. And you can
Um,
see that, I think, in their work. You can see that influence. Mhm.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're absolutely fantastic. They really are stunning. So I've been lucky. I mean, the titles, certainly the covers of my non-fiction naval history books set in this period have been
Mhm.
Van der Velde's, and I've never even thought of having anything else. And certainly the cover artists who produced the work for my novels, including Richard Enser himself, would freely admit, that the Van der Velde's have been a big influence on them. So they are incredibly influential.
That's great. Um, we received a question on X from Mickey Walker, who visited the London 1665 exhibit. He asks, given the views you expressed in the Restoration 360 lecture series, is press ganging really a possibility to account for the disaster? But before you answer, please, I just want to explain that this is in reference to the British warship, the London, which in 1665 mysteriously exploded in the Thames estuary, killing over 300 people, and it sank. So, please.
Right. Now, this is going to be one of those embarrassing moments where it would really help if I could remember what I said in that lecture, so that I
I
don't,
can't
so I
remember
don't,
either. I'm sorry.
so that I don't contradict myself.
It was what,
uh,
in 2020, I think we did that. So,
yeah, yeah, I know. Um, anyway, right. Okay. So yes, the London blew up, and it was clearly an accident. It was the start of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. She had a very new crew aboard. All the major ships had very new crews because obviously they were freshly manning the fleet, to go out to sail against the Dutch.
mhm,
Now, one of the problems we've got is we don't really know much about the composition of the crew. We know, but a lot of them were Yorkshiremen, because Sir John Lawson, the admiral, who also captained the ship, was a Yorkshireman. He had a lot of support in his native county. Um, uh, but I mean, there are all sorts of theories as to why the London blew up. That is one possibility, that it was an inexperienced crew. There was some sort of error. There was some sort of, mistake was made. Clearly, a mistake was made in handling the powder. But why that happened is still unclear.
mhm.
But yeah, I mean, work still continues on the wreck site. I mean, I think it was just yesterday, that they've come across yet more tremendous artifacts, and they've now had clearance to bring some of those up and so forth. I mean, the work that the dive team and the others associated with the wreck of the London have been doing is tremendous. It's a terrific project.
Yes, I'd like to learn more about what they've uncovered, and I think it's wholly fascinating, all of it. So thank you so much. But again, I don't remember what we said.
No,
Yeah.
no.
Let's talk a bit about the Matthew Quinton series, shall we? Which it contains, I believe, 9 books, including prequels. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not sure if I've ever said this in public before, so you might have a world exclusive here. There are actually 10 books. There are 9 that have been published, including prequels, and there is a 10th book which I wrote during the lockdowns. It hasn't seen the light of day, so if there are any publishers watching, then just a subtle hint. But yeah, there are 10 in total in the series, and the 10th one will hopefully see the light of day by some means or other eventually.
Oh, well, that's very interesting. I'm sure lots of readers will be very pleased to know about that. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Wow. So for the series, you begin, excluding the prequels, you begin in 1662, and we follow the inexperienced sea captain Matthew Quinton in Gentleman Captain. So what is a gentleman captain?
Okay. Well, at the Restoration, Charles II had a big problem, and obviously his brother James as well, because James was made Lord High Admiral, and so it's also his responsibility. The Navy had been one of the great sort of bastions of the Protectorate and the Commonwealth regime.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the officers and the captains in particular were ex-Commonwealth. They were, some of them had very radical political and religious views. They were suspects. They couldn't possibly be kept on in post. Okay, so to get rid of them. There were very few experienced Cavalier officers who would come in. So what Charles and James needed to do was to appoint new captains who were going to be loyal. Now, the obvious place to find loyal young candidates would be among the gentry and the aristocracy, the loyal gentry and the aristocracy.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the difficulty was that not necessarily that many of them had any experience at sea. And so they started appointing young captains who had very little experience, and that led to some quite interesting situations, both in terms of near misses with what was happening with the ships, but also in terms of conflict with some of the older officers, the Cromwellian officers, and so on. And so I'd always thought, well, this had tremendous potential for a novel, in that, you've got all these potential things happening that you can get quite a bit of drama out of. And so I thought, well, let's have a go at writing a novel set in this period and see where it goes. And the rest is history.
Yeah, great idea. And a great series, too. I've got most of them on Kindle. I have one as a paperback, but I also have the first one as an audiobook, and it was narrated by Jonathan Keeble.
It was.
And it was brilliantly done. So definitely recommend that. Now, out of all of your fiction books, which would you love to see made into a film, if you could just pick one?
Well, I suppose it would have to be the first one. gentleman captain. I think for logic's sake, really, and again, as I say, you've got so many strands. I mean, all of them have a lot of strands to them, but I mean, that one would certainly be one. For example, the Death's Bright Angel set against the Great Fire of London.
Mhm.
Obviously, in an ideal world, I like all of them filmed, but
Yeah.
there you go.
Yeah. Well, I hope to see something come about in the future. That would be great. Um, the you've written so many books, and they are must-haves if anyone wants to know more about this fascinating period. Uh, my favorite is Kings of the Sea, Charles II. This one. Woo.
Yeah.
Yep. Charles II, James II, and the Royal Navy. And it helped me so much in my own work, when I had to uh, understand complex things for naval history and events that happened during their reigns. Very, very important. And you've contributed so much to our knowledge of not just Stuart history, but British history in itself. And you've also written not just the Matthew Quinton series, but the Jack Stannard of the Navy Royal series, as well as the Philippe Cormont. Can you pronounce it for me?
Kermovant.
Cormont. Thank you. So loads for people to read and enjoy. Is there any 17th century music you like?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Purcell particularly. I mean, I've
Yes.
got I've got huge amounts of his, um, and sometimes go to concerts of his as well. I mean, my favorite composer of all, I must admit, is Handel. So just
Mhm.
slightly later.
Well, I
But
still refer to him as a 17th century person because he's
oh,
born 1685. So
very much, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very often, certainly when I'm writing. I mean, I have to have music in the background when I'm writing. I can't work in silence.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah. 'Cause
most of the time it's 17th, 18th century music that's playing.
wow, that's great because I have often asked this question to our previous guests, and I think most people have said that they can't write with music on, so they have to have
Yeah.
it silent. That's really interesting because I find I do need some period music to help. Um, yeah, but I think if it has a lot of words, that might be a little distracting sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have time for one last question. Um, well, really, it's the fantasy dinner party in the Stuart period. I
Hmm.
have to ask, who would you invite? What would you serve? And perhaps most importantly, who would you have sitting next to you?
Oh well, the last one's the easiest one actually, because I mean, I'd want to sit next to Peeps, because I
Yeah.
mean, I think all right, there are many aspects of Pepys's personality that are absolutely infuriating.
Yeah.
But I think he would be incredibly good company. He would obviously know everything about everybody else at the table, and I
Totally.
think that would be great.
Yeah.
Um, I'd want both Charles II and Cromwell, because
Oh.
that would probably guarantee a big punch up at the end of the evening. Um, but Cromwell was apparently more of a party animal than many people think he was. So, you know,
Mhm.
he's got this very dour image, but I mean, he was meant to be quite a fun guy.
Yeah. I
Um,
think he liked dancing, didn't he?
yeah, he did. He
Yeah.
did. Um, but in terms of the other side of the table, as it were, well, I think Barbara's got to be there. Obviously, I mean, she's well, for one thing, you as the title of your book suggests, I mean, the appetite alone. I mean, she's going to clear the plates, isn't she? um, after Ben,
Mhm.
I would love to have that. The one sort of possible oddity or the unexpected left field one I'd quite like to have would be Queen Christina.
Oh, yes,
Because
interesting.
she's such an enigmatic and fascinating figure, and I mean, clearly so incredibly intelligent.
Mhm.
Um, I think it'd be interesting to try to get to know her rather better, because you come across so many stories about her. As to what I'd serve them, though, well, I must admit I'm not very good on sort of main courses and savoury courses. So it would have to be a kind of a buffet with boring salmon and boring beef. But I'd want a dessert table that's piled as high as possible with as much as possible. Um, and again, I mean, okay, Barbara might particularly enjoy that, but I think, and Peep certainly would as well. But lots of pudding, lots of pudding.
Right. Well, if you can, I don't know how well you'd get on with Peeps if Barbara's present, because he might be a bit distracted with
Very,
the whole
very distracted.
time.
Yeah, very
Yes.
distracted.
Oh, that's great. Sounds like a lot of fun. Yes, but I think you might have a punch up there at the end. Yes,
Yeah.
if you have, yeah, and add a few more um, Republicans, perhaps, then there would definitely be some tensions by the end of that. Unless they all got drunk and had a happy time together. I don't
Yeah,
know. All right. Well, many thanks, David. Thank you so much for chatting with me today. It's been a pleasure.
absolutely. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks for inviting
Thank
me.
you. Bye.
Okay, bye now. Bye, everybody.
Right. Well, that was naval historian and author J D Davies. I always enjoy chatting with him, as I always learn so much. There's still some summer left, so if you're looking for a good book, or several for that matter, have a look online at David's website, www.jddavies.com. You can also follow him on X at Quinton Journals, and also on Facebook. His latest book, The Cursed Shore, was recently published in July. I hope you enjoyed this month's show, which was, as always, produced by Gavin of Orland Media and assisted by Juliet. Our next scheduled guest for the September show is historian Adrian Tinniswood, who will be talking with me about the Great Fire of London of 1666. For those of you coming to my upcoming talk at 1620's House in Leicestershire on the 31st of this month, I'll have 20 copies of Ravenous and 10 copies of The Stuart Vampire with me, available to purchase and sign. Of course, you could bring your own copies of my previous books to be signed there as well. Just don't forget to book. Well, that's all from me. All from me for this episode. Until next time, don't forget to keep it Stuart. Goodbye.